It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker. JSB is joining us today. He is a visiting scholar and advisor to the provost at the University of Southern California. He was the former chief scientist of Xerox, the director of its PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center. He occasionally teaches at UC Irvine, so he is officially a colleague. A glance at his website and you would see words like globalization and innovation, learning in a digital age, and creating a culture of learning. Today, his chosen title is Chief of Confusion, and the assistant who was printing the name tags didn't print his name tag because he thought it was a joke. But that is his chosen title, and here he is, and he's here to help us ask the right questions. So, John Seeley Brown, JSB.
What I want to talk about today is how do we do more with less? I'm going to call it Teaching 2.0. And looking at the issue of how might we really rethink productivity in a fun way, in an interesting way, in a way that accelerates learning, in a way that really thinks carefully about network affordances and how we might be able to use this network age in brand new types of ways. My intention is not to give a formal talk. I'm going to throw some very rapid sketches at you, and these sketches are meant to be evocative, and then we can kind of talk through the day about how different people interpret some of these sketches and what you might want to do with them. Let's just kind of look at a simple cartoon sketch having to do with kind of the Cartesian view of learning, which starts with kind of the very simple Cartesian, a Descartesian notion, I think, therefore I am. Knowledge is a substance. It is abstract. It is decontextualized. The more decontextualized it is, perhaps the better it is. And that, in fact, we think of pedagogy as how do we accelerate or facilitate knowledge transfer. If you really want to think in very fancy engineering terms, you say how do we get an ideal impedance match between kind of the picture of knowledge we have and a particular student's head so we can optimize the pouring of this. Typical types of kind of caricatures of this, as I said, is this notion of the delivery model. I teach, you learn, and the sense that each of our kind of disciplines lay out the attempt to create these very neat, not cross-coupling rows of knowledge. As I say, this is a caricature. I'm sure we all agree that this is a caricature. But I want to kind of cast a different point of view, one that I think understands why we have roundtables, by the way, is more of a social view of learning that contrasts with the Cartesian or Descartesian point of view, which really says maybe, just maybe, we participate, therefore we come into being, as opposed to I think, therefore I am. In fact, this has deep psychoanalytic roots in terms of object relation theory, but it actually extends beyond psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic routines, and developmental psychology, I think, all the way through. And you will see this kind of theme come back and forth as I show you some more of these kind of images. Perhaps the key notion here is why we participate, therefore we are, at least why we participate, part of it, is that most of our understandings are socially constructed. That has nothing to do with a postmodern belief that knowledge is socially constructed. I'm not claiming that whatsoever. As a scientist, it would be a little hard to claim that. But rather that our understanding of what we receive often in the classroom, we come to internalize that often through conversations with others, perhaps even a conversation with ourselves. But this understanding that we kind of bring, that we create, usually comes through some types of participations with others, conversations, and so on and so forth. In fact, this might suggest that when we think about learning, much more of this kind of chaotic space in which we learn in and through interactions with the world and with others. The idea of interactions, learning through interactions with the world we'll come back to, but has much more, of course, to do with one view of science, engineering, as well as dealing with deep problems of kind of ethics and so on and so forth. But that sense that it's our interactions with the world and with others that really do matter. And in fact, we all know in this room that one of the very few robust results in all the education psychology literature is the fact that the best single indicator of success in college is the ability of students to form their own study groups, form and join study groups. If they know how to do that, or if they do that, they will basically succeed. This is a pretty robust result. It's been replicated in many ways, and so on and so forth. And of course, in these study groups is where you might think that this whole notion of the social construction of understanding actually does happen. The curious thing to me is when we started thinking about this for a whole slew of reasons, is the question, do these study groups actually work if they're virtualized? Might you use instant messaging for study groups? Might you use things like Second Life? What are the types of ways in the net age that these study groups might work? And are they as effective as what happens face-to-face or as augmentations to face-to-face? And this is kind of the questions that we started out looking at. And much to our maybe surprise, as it turns out, under reasonable sets of conditions, virtual study groups work amazingly well. And in fact, one of the most interesting forms of study groups happens to take place in Second Life, where avatars, such as Larry's, maybe I'm not an avatar, meet face-to-face, shoulder-to-shoulder. Right? This notion of shoulder-to-shoulder is pretty interesting in the avatar world in terms of something like Second Life. Here, by the way, coming out of the University of Southern Queensland in Australia, is a very interesting Second Life rendering of a new kind of learning space where basically sitting around round tables like this, students can have conversations. They can be spread all over the world, by the way, but they look like they're in one room. And in fact, the instructor, as mentor, can actually immediately talk to everybody or can actually join any one of these tables wherever they be, avatar, of course, answer questions and so on and so forth, pull everybody back together again, and so on. So this is just kind of one example of a fairly surprising advance in terms of the use of Second Life as a way to kind of amplify this ability to think about using the virtual. In this case, it actually also does augment the physical, but it could actually, as we'll see in a moment, potentially do a job at replacing it. But I want to step back and say what we really now have in today's world, especially kind of the world that we all live in terms of Facebook, et cetera, we have this notion of, in terms of the Web 2.0 world, learning, we got to ask how we can support that with these types of participatory architectures that so characterize the Web 2.0 world, that many of us thought we'd made the major transformation coming into the Web 1.0 world. We all know the Web 2.0 world is where all our kids are at, all our students are at. And how do we start thinking about these participatory architectures like this? And in fact, it's no surprise that social nets, social networks, social graphs, things that underlie Facebook, things that underlie blogs, things that underlie MySpace, nowadays things that underlie LinkedIn, become a new type of social technology, a form of social computing that actually enables kids to build relationships or maintain relationships or amplify them, create all sets of affordances for building or supporting certain kinds of relationships. You got to ask, of course, how do these social graphs, these social technologies actually support learning? Well, of course, the idea of the study group is just one example. I was really hit by this because I was out visiting University of Michigan and working with John King, who is a vice provost out there at the university. I actually did my doctorate at the University of Michigan. And he said, well, John, how many students do you think we affect each year at the University of Michigan? And I said, well, last I recall, we have like 30,000 undergraduates and 15,000 graduates, plus or minus 5,000, depending if you want to count people that stay there forever trying to finish their thesis. So I say, let's say 50,000. He said, no, John, it's 250,000. I said, you, what? 250,000? And he says, yes, think about it a moment, John. Every single student that currently comes to University of Michigan comes from a community. And they have their friends that are either back there in their towns or now at different campuses, and they bring with them their profiles on Facebook. And in fact, these kids have very interesting bull sessions. If we all call bull sessions, that's where most of us actually did a lot of our learning, especially in terms of a liberal education. And these bull sessions kind of extend across the entire state. In fact, they reach beyond the state. They said, we haven't thought very much about this. And in fact, as we're now looking at how do we compute the value we create for the state, we kind of ignored the fact that there's all kinds of things happening between institutions, naturally occurring, that we don't even measure, we don't even see, because basically these social graphs obviously extend beyond the boundaries of our campus to all kinds of other places, including places after these kids leave into the supplier networks that define southern Michigan, and so on and so forth. So we have to think about that, because maybe we're doing a hell of a lot more than we get credit for. And so you can think about this as, as extended study groups, if you wish, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned the obvious examples, but this game itself is radically changing. So, for example, look at some of the newest things. I want to show you Ning for a moment. This is a brand new social space that's been designed to support learning communities on campuses. And just to give you kind of some idea of the amount of content, and this is less than like a few months old, maybe slightly older. I only discovered it a few months ago. It's just incredible, the kinds of things that are going on in just this one site in terms of building social graphs, social networks across all kinds of disciplines, all kinds of issues having to do with higher education. But it goes on. I just kind of discovered Ning, and lo and behold, what do I find? There's a new operation. This is still in stealth mode. I discovered this last week. That's combined the capabilities of Ning, LinkedIn, and Blackboard, creating a whole new site that is looking at building kind of a global learning platform, starting with kind of putting up open source information, the OpenCoursera, all the OpenCoursera information courses from MIT. We'll come back to that. This is a completely open network. This is not just using LinkedIn. This actually also opens and supports the new global Google social protocols for open social, open ID, and so on. And so you see now kind of attempts to take these naturally occurring social graphs, and let's see how do we transform more of them into more focused type of learning activities. But let's go on, because I think this Web 2.0 world actually has some other interesting properties to it, because it is creating a new kind of participatory medium, if you wish. And in some ways, I think Marshall McLuhan once said the medium is the message, or something like that. So let's look at this in terms of the long tail of education. I think we're all familiar in the internet age with the long tail. I think Amazon brought us this in terms of showing that they could make a tremendous amount of money selling books that only sell one book a year, which is down at the very thin part of the long tail. But the long tail is kind of a Pareto distribution. And how does it apply to us here? It applies to us in several ways. The surprising thing to me, and now that more of your kind of finances are slightly more opened, you can kind of recognize that basically 20% of your courses produce 80% of your revenue. And in fact, 80% of your cost goes to comes from this kind of thin tail. So 80% of your revenue comes from the fat part of the tail, and 80% of your cost comes from these very niche types of research seminars that is, of course, what makes a university a university. So we have to kind of think about this, because it is clear that certain types of teaching technologies function in the fat part of the tail that are quite different than the thin part of the tail. And we may want to look at ways to rethink learning technology, education technologies in different parts of the tail. And of course, it is kind of recognized by and large that in most of our universities you start kind of taking general courses in the fat part of the tail, then you roll down that curve and eventually specialize into research seminars later on in your third, fourth year in the graduate school courses made up almost all of that. Let me show you a couple of examples for very interesting technologies in the fat part of the tail. And then I want to focus more on the thin, long part of the tail, where most of the cost actually gets eaten up. In terms of the fat part of the tail, let me show you one of the most intriguing things. This is a major law course at the Harvard Law School called the Court of Public Opinion. And this particular course is actually taught in 3 tiers. You basically have the full-paying Harvard law students that come face-to-face with the instructor. And then you have a Harvard Extension program that students also pay for at a different rate. And that course actually transpires all in Second Life. And they have a special instructor in Second Life that basically holds office hours, where they will pump all the material from the First Life into that. But Second Life, you can actually have an instructor there, you have office hours, you have discussion groups, and all these kinds of things. Very interesting notion. And then, of course, they take it to third tier, and they just open the entire thing open, where now you can just participate and listen. Pardon me, you can listen, but you cannot participate. So they have a very interesting notion of a three-tier scheme that's trying to get more bang for the buck, so to speak. It's just an experiment that's been working out very well at Harvard. And if you go to Google, you can easily find a lot of stuff being written about this. Let me show you one other example. And this example blew my mind. I actually came across this example for bizarre reasons, but this is Walt Lewin. Walt Lewin is actually, depending on if they're physicist here, is a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he's teaching the classical mechanics course at MIT, which is a huge lecture course with 800 people and so on and so forth. We're going to come back to these big classes in a moment, but he is actually kind of like Richard Feynman. There's something magnetic, unbelievably charismatic, and to see how he not just teaches but reasons about stuff is an amazing phenomenon. I was trained in physics and math, but I find watching these courses still enlightening. I was stunned when I discovered that this open courseware at MIT actually is on iTunes and is the fourth most popular video on iTunes. Now let me clarify this. This is not iTunes U that many of us in this room know about. This is iTunes, period. This has to do with all the entertainment video in the world funneled through iTunes. And the fourth most popular entertainment video that people just want to watch is this. What's going on here? Pretty interesting. In fact, the seventh most popular course is another iTunes, seventh most popular video, at least the last time I checked, was likewise an open course at MIT. Now, of course, in iTunes U, this is number one. But in terms of iTunes video, this is number 4. Wow, that's really getting a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of leverage happening there. And I got to tell you, watching these things, it is an amazing experience, beginning to see how I can kind of almost enter into the mind of Walter as he's doing this. But let's get back to the theme. The theme has to do with maybe the thin tail. The thin tail is where all the research seminars lie, or all the specialty courses lie, that all the faculty at all the at the UC campuses love to teach, with 12 graduate students or 12 to 15 undergraduates coming together around a particular research topic. This is where, of course, the cost goes. But this is also, of course, what makes a university that many of us think. I want to take an example of this thin, long, costly tail. I want to kind of look at Italian literature. In an advanced Italian literature course, you're apt to find on this campus and most of the campuses across CUC a seminar on one of the most famous novels in Italian literature called the Decameron novel, written about the Black Plague and what happened to the families that pulled out of Florence and kind of took residence up in the hills, and how they approached life, how they entertained themselves, and so on and so forth. This is one of the most major novels in Italian literature. The number of courses around the United States that teach or meet around this topic, probably every major university has their own research seminar on this. Brown University got together and said, well, why don't we create a portal? Let's call it the Decameron Web. It's been now slightly renamed around the Digital Humanities Hub, but let's think of it as the Decameron Web portal, where all the world's best scholars come to meet. Everything they write, all their thinking, all their questions get posted on this web. And furthermore, the debates between scholars in this, you can actually witness. This is turning out to be not only a fantastic resource for students studying the Decameron Web, but they begin to understand the practices of scholarship because they hear the professors themselves arguing back and forth. And of course, if you happen to know much about the humanities, you know that they tend to write huge papers. On the Decameron Web, actually a professor can write a 5-page paper around a single simple point, making it also much more accessible. And graduate students can actually contribute and enter these types of conversations, put their own material up, and get a professor in Italian literature any place in the world to be able to comment and critique this. So we begin to see a kind of a new type of place being created in cyberspace that leads to very deep scholarly interactions. And in a way, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, opens up some of the processes and practices of real scholarship in this particular type of field. And the practices of scholarship around this is different than the practices of the scholarship around being a physicist and so on and so forth. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But it does provide a very interesting view into these practices because it is a kind of open peer review system going on all the time. That's just the beginning. I can take you to dozens of sites now like this for very specialized types of courses, bodies of material. They aren't courses, but you can see that by participating in this kind of a site, how you begin to enculturate into these types of practices of this kind of scholarship. But this kind of poses another kind of an issue. Let's think about it a moment. And then, in fact, many of us kind of are used to the notion that we spend in the first 2 years of college, universities, at least, if not much longer, teaching a lot about something. And maybe after you have taught about something, after students have been through all the prerequisites, and then eventually they get to actually learn something about being something, not just about something. They begin to enter the practices of this field, not just knowledge about this field. Learning to be, enculturating into the practices of the field often via legitimate peripheral participation, apprenticeship also. But it is a way of being. It is a way of seeing. It's being able to engage in productive inquiry in useful ways. It is a way of knowing. It's a notion of sensing. What constitutes an interesting problem? By the way, think just how important that is as you train, especially your graduate students. And it also has a lot to do with knowing what constitutes an elegant solution. What hit me, as I started out, I was actually being trained in theoretical mathematics, certain type of algebraic group theory. And it wasn't until my second year in graduate school at the University of Michigan when I was taking a seminar with Paul Helmos, a moderately famous research mathematician. And for the first time ever, I saw him legitimately get stuck on a problem. And I saw him honestly struggle, all of us in that seminar, saw him honestly struggle with a problem. And for the very first time after 6 years of training in theoretical mathematics, I began to know what it meant to be a mathematician. I had no idea of the fuzzy, sloppy, intuitive thinking that underlies research mathematics. In fact, you might even claim this as a conspiracy when you read these proofs that are published. They come out of divine God or something like this. But no, they really come from messing around a lot. But it's very hard to get a feeling. I mean, of course, you try to prove theorems or find theorems and prove them. I mean, find conjectures and prove conjectures and so on. But you feel like a fool because you're kind of all over the map. You keep thinking these brilliant research mathematicians kind of see through to the end. This was the first time I saw a brilliant mathematician have to struggle. It was an amazing moment for me and got me the first insight into what was going on. And so you got to ask, is it possible that we should think about maybe how we get people engaged more rapidly in the practices of a field, in learning to be, and then from that, when they get stuck on problems, then how do you actually move up to learning more about? And somehow there's kind of a cycle around here in terms of productive inquiry, where you're engaged in something real, you get stuck, and then you have a kind of learning on demand in terms of learning more about something. So there's kind of a notion of saying maybe we need to rethink the flow, so to speak, of how this works. Now, of course, there's a lot of us in this room that say, John, this is hardly new. And that's correct, because after all, look at the architectural studio, which is an amazing motif, I think, or at least theme, for how we may want to think about learning. I'm going to call this the atelier form of learning. And if you go into an architectural studio at any of the UC campuses, what you really find is that basically, this is a social environment. It's a social environment in which, unlike a lot of the academy, all work in progress is always rendered completely public. So each student is working on his or her design problem, but all the other students in that studio are participating in each other's struggles. They see each other's work. They see the models. The walls are plastered with sketches and so on and so forth. So they're participating in each other's experience in trying to build this thing, each student's project. And then every once in a while, the master comes in and critiques a particular project. And because everybody hears the critique. But that critique now gets interpreted in a much more kind of thick, nuanced framework. Because everybody else in that room has participated in some of the struggles that that poor student has gone through, him or herself. And so you have a very interesting notion of how we're turning that entire environment such that every move that the master makes actually becomes a significant learning event for everyone in that studio. All because work in progress is rendered public, but also because basically studios are about practices. And what they're really trying to teach in the studio is the practice of being, to become, to be, not just about architecture. Obviously, there, of course, is about architecture that complement this. Well, that's great, John. Nobody in this room probably is a professor of architecture, so why are you here talking about it? Well, I'll tell you why I'm here talking about it. And it has to do with one of the most successful learning events that I've seen. And this started at RPI, but it's been picked up by MIT, and now it's been picked up at, actually maybe even before MIT, at North Carolina State University. I want to tell you about this. MIT has a course in electromagnetic theory, Maxwell's field equations, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually introductory E&M. And guess what? This course is brilliant. This course is the best way to discover that you don't want to be a physicist. They may start out with 800, and they will probably end up with 200. So the dropout rate of this course is phenomenal. And by the way, I don't know if, I'm sure there's some physicists here, but it's not too surprising because Maxwell's field equations aren't usually understood in terms of causality. They're understood in terms of partial differential equations and blah, 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 which are, by the way, very hard to get a gut feeling for. MIT thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Maybe this is a real waste of resources. Could we think about this massive course completely differently? The answer is yes. They decided to take this lecture course and break it up in terms of a studio. So the entire course is taught as a studio. And as a studio, it means that basically they put these round tables very much like this, 9 students to a table, in a room kind of like this. And basically, kind of the instructor might come in and do kind of a few moments of recitation and then throws out a set of problems for students to work on at each table, throws out experiments because the tables all have computers, they all have other equipment to do experiments with, and basically this really becomes kind of like an atelier where these kids actually start engaging in doing stuff in physics. albeit simple, but nevertheless there. They're building, by the way, they aren't just doing simulations, they're actually building simulations themselves. Why do I say that? Because if you actually build a simulation, you actually begin to understand how to solve a partial differential equation. I won't bore you with why that's true, but it kind of is true. But here is the catch. When they first rolled this out on an experimental basis, it worked fantastic. And then tried to scale it up, and it was a disaster. Why? Because this was a radical idea, and virtually none of the professors had any idea how to move from being a sage on the stage to being a mentor. So they had to put the course on hold for a while, and they took the professors and the TAs, and they decided to have a whole workshop like this you have, to spend a fair amount of time saying, how do you become a mentor rather than a sage on the stage? Because these new technologies involve new types of teaching practices as well, and you don't just pick up a new practice very easily, especially if you spend 20 years being a sage on the stage. So something has to happen. Well, they got that done, and then guess what happened? Somehow, it still didn't work all that well. At least the experimental one did, but not as they started to scale it up. Why? And then they suddenly realized they're marking on a curve. MIT is an extraordinarily competitive place. And if you have 9 kids sitting around working with each other, kind of like in your pre-med programs here at UC Davis, these kids are kind of interested in beating out the other kids. And so they suddenly changed the marking from not being on a curve, but an absolute. And whammo, almost overnight, this thing transformed how kids learn physics. This is now sufficiently popular that more and more courses are being taught at MIT this way. North Carolina State had a bigger problem. They really wanted to turn out kids in their state. They really did have an ability to think analytically, to understand the sciences, and especially women and minorities, which were a lot of the populace at North Carolina State. So they took this idea and they scaled it up, where now thousands and thousands and thousands of students do this. Let me show you some of the latest data. They found out that by turning this thing inside out, upside down, they have managed to transform the failure rate. So the rate of failure for women is 1/5, 20% of what it used to be in terms of the completion, successful completion of this course. The minorities, you can look at this table, but the data is not small. We're talking about doing this now on tens of thousands of people. This data looks pretty damn solid and gives you some sense of what is possible in terms of we really want to reach people that traditionally have a hard time understanding the other way of learning in terms of this studio-based, peer-based, collaborative sense of legitimately participating in some of these practices. So where am I headed? Well, those are kind of fitting within the model, but basically, let's step back a moment and go back to this long tail. And the last graph I showed you was the long tail in teaching. I want to talk about the long tail in learning and ask a more fundamental question. Might there be new ways to actually get kids to kind of understand and participate and become passionately interested in all kinds of highly, highly, highly specialized topics? In the long tail of the internet, I claim that it is virtually impossible not to be able to find an existing community of interest passionately engaged in topic X if I'm interested in topic X. It's almost like a compactness theorem in a topological space. That space is covered. There are 1 million groups just in Yahoo alone. If you start looking at what's happening in these groups like Nixie or Ninja, you see even more. I mean, you don't see more than 2 million, 1 million, but I mean, you see another kind of group starting. And what I'm going to argue is that there's naturally occurring, independent of us, unbelievable things already happening out there. That we might want to look at how these kids can be encouraged to find them, join them, and learn from them. Because if we can do that, of course, we've cracked the problem in many ways of lifelong learning. The catch here is how do you think about this kind of long tail this passion-based, is kind of enculturating into a practice via legitimate peripheral participation, which happened a little bit in the studios, but now happens all the time if you actually look what's going on in the internet as people find these passionate groups, find a group that reflects their passion, interest, and so on. I just want to show you a couple of these, and this is what actually first got me going on this topic some years ago. Open source. Now, everybody in this room knows what open source, you know what Linux, Apache, JBoss, et cetera, is. How many people think about this movement as a major movement teaching students computer science, the practices of computer science, more than maybe all the students we currently have in the UC system? I claim there are over 1 million students right now learning the practices of computer science, not the theory, the practice of computer science, by joining different types of groups in open source. There's a catch. If you want to join a group like Linux, you got to kind of figure out, it is an epistemic culture. You got to figure out kind of what does it mean to be in that culture. What are, for example, the sensibilities of that community? How do you become attuned to those sensibilities? Let me just say a couple of things in almost any of the open source courses, communities that I know. And then each one, by the way, has much more specialized issues here. One thing is, if you want to be a heroic member of one of these communities, you learn to write code for others to read. Now, this may seem obvious, but I will tell you, when I was trained to be a computer scientist, we had a macho culture that if I could write code that worked, that nobody else in my class could figure out, maybe even the instructor, I was a hero. This is the fastest way to fail in becoming a key member of the open source community. You have to write code for others so they learn and they have a chance to improve. They have a chance to improve because that's the form of legitimate peripheral participation. They can start in the periphery and they can tinker with your code and make it better. And by the way, this is a community that social capital matters a great deal. Reputations get built by, can I do hard stuff? Can I do it in a way that other people can build on it? Am I willing to contribute things for other people to build? And so on and so forth. So this is kind of a whole new form of distributed, situated learning, almost like a distributed form of cognitive apprenticeship. And it's happening right around us all the time. How much are we observing this? Can we leverage things like that? Let me go to the second example. Astronomy, amateur astronomy. Now, first of all, let me kind of go back to the word amateur, because I was brought up thinking that amateur was second class to professional. But amateur comes from Latin amator, meaning love, or to love. So amateur groups are groups that come together around the passion that they have. It is not a commentary on the skills that they have. In fact, well, I'll leave it there. So there's some interesting kind of interplay between the amateur and the professional. Now, let me tell you about amateur astronomy. And by the way, I mean, I don't know if there are astronomers here, but UC Davis is phenomenal in some of this stuff I'm about to talk about. In astronomy now, if you are an amateur, you can build yourself a Dobsonian telescope. A Dobsonian telescope can be a 12-inch reflector mirror, 16-inch, sometimes less than 12 inches. You can build a serious telescope for $3,000. Now, but that's not the end of it. What you can do is you can go and find, you don't have one right here, but you can find a security camera, buy a security camera, tear it apart, and take the sensors out of that security camera, and you can shove it into the focal plane of that telescope. And you can take your laptop and put a digital signal processing element code on your laptop and take the digital feed off of that sensor, and you can enhance that picture so that that sucker right there becomes more powerful than the 200-inch Mount Palomar telescope, which was the biggest telescope this world had until 20 years ago. Now, obviously, the Mount Palomar telescope has figured this out too, so they do their things. So this means all of a sudden, as an amateur, you can start to explore deep space in ways that were unthinkable a little while ago. But that's not the end of it, because basically there's the internet. And the internet, you can hook these telescopes together. So you can do triangulation. Even more important, because there's so many amateurs that can now do this, you can watch the sky on a 7/24 basis. This, by the way, is what professionals can't do. So all of a sudden, there's a chance for amateurs to detect things before the professionals can. And in fact, there's a famous case in 1987, picking up a supernova. There had already been kind of some alert to this in terms of a set of neutrons that were being picked up, 12 in fact, they aren't easy to pick up. And basically it was two amateur astronomers that happened to be watching the sky 2.5 hours after the neutrons were detected, and 3 hours after. The 2.5 hour guy looking at that part of the sky saw no optical explosion. The 3 hours later did. That was the critical piece of data that led to the proof, the empirical proof, of one of the most famous major theories in gravitational physics that we have today. All of a sudden, the amateurs and the professionals suddenly realized they could complement each other in very powerful ways. And so a kind of a new type of fraternity started to develop between these two. It gets more serious. This is ironic to me, being from the United States. This is a telescope in Maui. This is a fairly important telescope, and this telescope is all robotically controlled. So you can grab this telescope, and you can make your own measurements from any place in the world. I say it's ironic because this telescope, when it was first built, although built on American territory, was limited to students in England and students in Australia. Because no one in this country thought it was important to be able to allow our students to use the internet to attach to a major scientific instrument. That's now changing. In fact, we have a whole set of telescopes now that students get access to. But here's a very major piece that just fed into the ability for these students in high school to actually start to explore images in deep space. And let me kind of show you the last example here. This has just been released. This is very close to some of the things going on here on this campus. This is called a Worldwide Telescope. And what this project has done is taken all the images from all the major telescopes in the world and has fused them in very clever mathematical computational ways together. So these guys now have a full 3D view of the galaxies. And as a student on this system, you can fly through any galaxy that you want. And I got to tell you, when you do that, you can't help but be struck by awe. This is an amazing experience. But on top of that, basically you can have a docent take you through the space, take you through the galaxies, commenting on what you're seeing. And those become playlists that can be remixed. Students can create their own. Faculty can create their own. Share them, remix them, so on and so forth. And in fact, one of the first docents is Brian Greene, the father of the elegant universe, string theorist, is the first guy to go on a trip through the galaxy for students to be able to follow him and observe his kind of observations, going back a little bit to Walter Lewin. So these are some of the things that are just now dropping out in the net age. And any laptop, actually it has to be a PC at the moment, but any PC, I'm sure to be expanded, can actually download all this because it's kind of like Google Earth taken into the universe. And this was first started by Jim Gray, who tragically died in the ocean out here a little while ago. And now it's being done by Curtis Wong at Microsoft. But this is open public stuff. And final example in physics, here is a nano hub. Every campus on UC system has courses in nanotechnology. Well, here's now a national hub. All the equipment to run experiments, simulations, et cetera, to be able to say, we can get together on the net. Here is a place to come, to run experiments, and so on and so forth. And this is just kind of the beginning of what is happening. So what I want to do in the last few minutes is kind of step back and ask, what's the bigger picture here? I've given you through a whole bunch of little examples. One aspect of the bigger picture is we're entering what you might call a perfect storm of opportunity. We talked briefly about open courseware. There are now at least 3,500 courses in the Open Courseware Consortium that are the complete curricula, and some of them even the video lecturing of classes. And by the way, one of the things that I just did a review for Hewlett Foundation on Open Courseware, Dan Atkins and I. And one of the things that I found so interesting is that in some ways the byproduct of doing Open Courseware for all the courses at MIT turned out to be maybe more significant than the original idea. Because what started to happen is you have all these prerequisites. And basically those prerequisites have been in play for often 5 or 10 years. But the courses themselves have changed. So all of a sudden, on my own, privately, I can kind of open up and I can see kind of what the course that I'm supposedly preparing these students for actually does now need. And so you suddenly get professors looking at each other's courses, which is a very thing that does not happen in general, and looking in detail at the problem sets and so on and so forth. And so you start to get implicitly, through an emergent property, much more alignment through sequences of courses, and much better, kind of, as I say, strategic alignment that is happening there. Just one of the kind of byproducts that may turn out to be one of the most significant aspects of what it meant to do all the courses at a particular university. The telescopes I showed you and the Nano Hub was a very simple example of e-science. There are probably 100 beautiful examples right now on e-science. Some of them, by the way, at the University of California system. I showed you that the Cameron Web is just one simple example. There are an unbelievable number of sites on history, the Valley of the Shadows, on Civil War, etc., that have these sites now. And then this general sense of the kind of Web 2.0 world, which has a lot to do with kind of the open source, is just an example of a participatory structure. What happens if you start tying all these things together? So you can now actually take some of the materials coming out of these open courseware, tie it to some of the instrumentation you can do in e-science, and then engage in some of the passion and interest stuff that's happening in the Web 2.0 world. You start to be able to see ways to tie content, tools, and activities together in a way that we might eventually create kind of what you might think of as an open participatory learning architecture and infrastructure, where basically things are getting fed back all the time so we can accelerate our ability to kind of improve the material. So we're looking at now, at Hewlett Foundation, is how might you do this around the world to kind of create a new kind of ecosystems that kind of really do a deep intertwining of these different types of things that I just mentioned on the left, having to do with intertwining knowledge creation, learning, and mentoring, kind of like all together. You can tell in the examples I've chosen that there's something else going on here. I don't know how best to talk about it, but it has a little bit to do with a kind of a pedagogical shift from, as I said, the sage and the stage, to forms of peer-based learning. And the interesting thing about peer-based learning is basically sage on the stage basically is a linear model of learning. If you can get peer-based learning, then at least you have a quadratic. And if this peer-based learning is actually tied into social nets that feed back on themselves, suddenly you've gone from a linear model to an exponential model. We can't yet begin to understand what that means, but I think there's something deep that's going to come out of that. And of course, in that sense, on the right-hand side, peer-based learning, you can't think of a better type of preparation for lifelong learning, i.e. continuous learning. And there's obviously examples that I have given that basically this kind of peer-based learning is highly situated and is, of course, leveraged by social network. But I want to argue that something much more serious is going on, something we don't talk much about. It's an epistemological shift. I'm going to claim in the 20th century we thought so much about education and the tools to support it as basically thinking about, I'm going to call it a Homo sapien point of view. A Homo sapien where basically knowledge became the game. And yes, we had tools, but those tools became instruments. And they became instruments for reasons to do things. I want to say that maybe what you see now happening, and you see why in a second, we're moving from a position of Homo sapiens to Homo faber. That is to say, man as maker, not man as possessor of knowledge. Man as maker suddenly transforms the sense of knowledge into the more active notion of knowing. And a very subtle transformation starts to happen as I move from tools as instruments to basically tools that I use to engage in productive inquiry, because it is through the tools I start to have a very interesting kind of relationship to doing stuff where I can start to interpret why something is pushing back at me. It's a much more subtle form of knowing. Some of my work in material science is learning how to interpret why those atoms don't want to move where you want them to go, et cetera, that actually start to give you a feel for things. And so somehow we got to think about how this world, where more and more stuff we do is indirect, how do we start to look at this as kind of a way to extend a conversation with the world and to interpret the pushback thereof? Now, I don't want to bore you with this, but I'm going to argue that Dewey, in his notion of pragmatic technologies, actually had this idea, but the world was not ready for it. The infrastructures were not ready for it. And the curious thing to me is we are now ready for it. What can we do about this? Because we can do a lot of making in the virtual world very easily. In fact, think about tinkering. Many of you are not quite as old as I, but I don't know about you folk, but I sure started out life being a tinkerer. I tinkered on radios, transmitters, automobiles, to the horror of my parents' motorcycles, etc. Starting around 1980, tinkering disappeared. Many of you don't even know what I'm talking about. You never, well, that's a moderately older audience, but many of today's kids, the 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, they say, well, John, I didn't tinker. Well, of course you didn't tinker. Tinkering disappeared. And it disappeared because, take your watch. You can't open this watch and find out how it works. It's a silicon chip in there. Take your automobile. You can't open and make sense of an automobile, because basically the automobile is becoming a very fancy term, cognitively impenetrable. Mere mortals cannot understand how that car works, and it is not meant to let you tinker with it. Well, curiously, here in California, it's even worse than that, because I actually do tinker on cars today, because I can open that chip. And now it turns out that there is a state law against anyone who tinkers with the car in terms of changing the timing chip or anything like that. And we had a cat and mouse game for about 5 years, and finally the law came down and said, no matter how clever you are, no. We detect that that chip has been modified, you've had it. So even there, for those that could actually penetrate this opaque black box, it's been ruled out. Starting around 1995, between 1995 and 2000, tinkering came back full force. Every one of your students is a tinkerer. I will bet you any amount of money. Tinkering now happens in the digital world. Obviously, open source is almost nothing but tinkering. But then look what you do with remixing music. Look what you do with photography. Look what you do on YouTube. Look what you do on Flickr. Look what you do in terms of modifying this kind of stuff. Look at blogs. Blogs are a very interesting form of tinkering where I take what somebody did, link to that, and say something else about that. So you're kind of tinkering with now arguments and so on and so forth. And so tinkering is back, and it's back in a very interesting way, because tinkering is now totally gender neutral. Tinkering in the past basically built silos. Guys tinkered in ways quite different than women tinkered. But in this new cyber world, basically tinkering is neutral and equally accessible in all domains to each. So what I really want to suggest is Life in the digital age, that is to say, our students today, come from a culture of participation where tinkering, building, remixing, and sharing is a fundamental part of their epistemology. It is a fundamental part of who they are, where basically they start to construct meaning by what they create and other people build on. Just look at Facebook as a trivial little, if not horrifying example, or open source is a positive example. But I mean, basically this sense that I create something, and if you pick it up and build on it, then part of my identity gets magnified. So meaning for me comes what I have produced and other people build on. So what I produce, what I share, other people build on. This is a sense of identity. This has a sense of identity having to do, as one of my earlier slides talked about, in terms of what community of practice do I belong to. So I learn to belong. My identity comes from belonging. And we now have very interesting passion-based interest groups where my identity is created more and more by my ability to join, belong, and perform, create, and share. This is the remix world that we are actually entering today. So I want to kind of do a pun, and the pun is we're basically on the verge right now of taking something normally thought of as recreation, and notice that recreation is simply recreation. Or let me put a hyphen in there. Recreation world is the world of remix. It is the world of tinkering, and so on. And if we can actually pull off a transformation that says I can move from thinking of recreation as a form of passive entertainment to recreation as a form of activity-based, creating things that other people want, pick up on, and remix themselves, and I get a sense of accomplishment and meaning and identity through that, we will, I think, be a major step toward creating a culture of learning. I mean, a culture that really does thrive on this peer-based participatory learning. We're creating tinkering and inquiry, all amplified, all afforded to by the capabilities of the net and the technologies that each of us in this room has been thinking about. And so I'll end with one slide. This is a chart that talks about how basically the primary roles of professor, learning activities, institutional arrangements, and student behavior might actually change from an education 1.0 world to an education 2.0 world to what I'm going to call a tinkering world, which they call education 3.0, although I think between, and you will see in this chart if you look at it carefully, there's kind of a continuous smear between education 2.0 and education 3.0. And under the kind of the final column there on the right, the primary role of the professor becomes orchestrator of collaborative knowledge creation. Learning activities, blah, 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 blah. Social networking outside traditional boundaries. Institutional arrangements. Regional and institutional boundaries seriously break down. Student behavior. A strong sense of ownership of education, co-creation, and the co-creation of the very resources that actually get used in the learning experiences themselves. Now this struck me as being pretty visionary. You know where I found this? I found this in South Africa. This is what they are doing in South Africa. Pretty sobering when you look at that right-hand column and you think, where are we relative to that? And with that, thank you.